Hello and welcome back to On the Workbench. Today we're going to be replacing the cylinder head on an 8.75 gross torque Toro Timemaster mower. The reason I'm replacing the entire head today is I'm about 99% confident I've got a blown head gasket, and I've also had a couple other stripped out threads on the engine head that I've had to deal with. So I'm going to be replacing the head and the head gasket, and so here's how to do the process. The parts that we're going to need for this is, well, the engine head service kit that Briggs Stratton sells. And so in the box you get, I've already unboxed this, already make sure I got everything I need, is my cylinder head, which does come with the valves, nice and clean. And then there's another box with the valve, the rest of the valve parts. We're going to have to adjust our valves. And then we have an envelope with our gaskets. The kit that I got did not come with replacement head bolts, so I'm going to have to save those head bolts. But I've got the gaskets and everything else I need to be able to rebuild this head. The tools that you're going to need for this are a lot simpler than what it probably looks here on the screen. First of all, let's talk about sockets. We're going to need a 5/8 inch spark plug socket. We're going to need an 8mm socket and a 10mm socket, a 13mm socket. And then just for redundancy, I've got an extra 10mm socket and a deep 8mm socket. These latter two, not necessary, but it just helps me to have a few more options at my disposal. Then I've got a 3/8 and a 1/4 inch, 4-inch long extension, a 3/8 ratchet, and a 1/4 inch ratchet. Most of this is going to be done with 1/4 inch drive tools. And then I've got a little 1/4 inch hand drive extension from Mac. This is a really nifty tool that I really like. But you can find other spinners that are very similar to this that you can use. You're also going to need a set of feeler gauges, something that goes down to about 0.05, give or take, inches, a gasket scraper or a razor blade, a T20 Torx key or Torx screwdriver, a 1/4 inch and a 3/8 torque wrench. We also may want just a small flat bladed screwdriver just for some scraping and some prying apart, and a little bit of sandpaper to smooth our gasket surfaces after we use our gasket scraper. And so relatively easy. You're going to need about maybe 45 minutes to an hour's worth of your time. Follow along. We'll do this together. All right, to get started on our head gasket and cylinder head replacement, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come up on top of the engine, and there's going to be 3 8mm bolts around our starter. We're going to take those bolts, loosen those, and take the starter off. And then that will allow us to remove our engine cowling off to the side, like that. And then we can move on. And the next step is going to be to remove our guard here over our carburetor springs. And so this is going to be removed with an 8mm socket on the rear. I've already pre-loosened these bolts to make this go just a little faster here. And then a 10mm socket on the front. And then we're going to want to remove our spark plug to go ahead and take out the wire off the boot. In my case here, I happen to have a hour meter, but I'm going to replace the hour meter as well. So I'm going to go ahead and remove my hour meter winding from here. Then I'll take a 5/8 spark plug socket, fit that onto the spark plug. I'm a big fan of this SK extra long spark plug. It's got the knurling on the end that I can just remove this by hand after I use the ratchet to break it free. Spark plug out. And now I'm going to come around and deal with the exhaust next. So there's going to be an 8mm bolt here on top to remove. And then there's one more bolt over here. You may need an extension to get this one out. And one through the other side of the hole. Work that around the end of the muffler. Set this in the 3 screws aside. And then our muffler is held on with 2 13mm hex heads. Now in the process of the muffler, pay attention, there are a series of gaskets on the back side of the muffler because you've got our exhaust valve port here, and we've got a couple gaskets on either side, and we've got our thermostat linkage. I'm just going to go ahead and set that on top or off to the side like that. Our kit comes with replacement gaskets, but I'm just going to set these aside with my rest of my muffler parts. As you might be able to see, I had to replace the threads on this side of the muffler port. And also, incidentally, if you need to know what the exact model number of your engine is, right here is the model information on the top line of your engine. If you need to look it up on Toro, or really you're going to use that on the Briggs Stratton website, because the Toro website won't tell you anything about this engine. You've got to go to the Briggs website to look up your model number to get any more specific information pertinent to your mower. So now we're going to go to the other side, to the carburetor side. And now the next step is going to be to remove our air intake assembly. Use an 8mm socket to remove these 2 bolts. And then there's going to be a tube in the back here that you can just push off. That goes onto this port right here. Pay attention, there is a paper gasket right here that mates onto your carburetor. So then you can just take your air cleaner assembly and set that aside. And now we're on to the beginning of the messy part of this, where we're going to have to deal with the fuel system and the oil system. So I'm going to go ahead and put a blue shop towel underneath my engine here. Now in my engine, I went ahead and replaced the fuel filter with the shutoff valve. So I'm just going to go ahead and shut off the fuel like that. If you don't have the shutoff valve in place, you may want to get a small bowl to help drain out the fuel. So this should provide just a minimal amount of fuel leakage. And then I'm going to put a red shop towel, or red rag, underneath here as well to hopefully catch as much of the falling material as possible. This is also a great time to use your cell phone to snap a picture of how all these linkages go together here on top, because you're going to have to reassemble these linkages when you're done to make sure that your carburetor is working correctly. There's 2 springs, and make sure you know which linkage goes on which side. So I can go ahead and take off my exhaust side, spin that around. And then now I'm going to use an 8mm socket on a short extension to remove my carburetor. And before I get that too loose, make sure I remove this governor spring. Like that. And then I can just set that aside like that. I almost had my front spring get away from me. I'm going to make sure I secure this spring very carefully. And now you've got a choice. We're eventually going to have to remove this valve cover. But just for the sake of cleanliness, I think I'm going to go ahead and remove my entire engine head first. pay attention, this little bolt, that bracket there, should have come off with the carburetor. I'm going to set that aside. And so using a 10mm socket, I'm going to loosen up my head screws. And you can see I've got 3 out of the 4. That fourth one on the bottom is the issue. And then I take the head off. See, I've got my push rods, a little bit of oil, and you can clearly see how my head gasket is completely blown right there, which is exactly why I was getting 0 compression on my compression gauge, because it was just able to blow completely out the side. So replacing the head gasket, and in my case the head, is indeed the right fix. So I'm going to go ahead and take my push rod out. I'm going to put that back in like that. And now we're going to go over to the bench to prep our head. Now when it comes to taking a look at our old head, we can see that indeed there's a spot where the head gasket was blown. And then we also have, here's our head bolt that I wasn't able to get out on the lower side of the engine. And then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 bolts to remove to access our valve cover gasket. And then on the side, here's a helicoil I had to put in to redo that hole a while back. Then I also previously stripped out a hole on my overhead valve cover as well. So that's why I'm just replacing the entire head today. There's obviously some oil leaking out of this, which is fine. That's why I got the paper down here on the workbench to try to keep it clean. And so we're going to have to salvage the overhead valve cover off of here because that was not included with our new head. And now back at the mower, I'm going to take a cloth and wipe down that mating surface for the gasket and to see how much of that damaged gasket is still there, because we're going to want our new gasket to be able to sit as flush as possible. I can see there's a fair bit of gasket residue right around where the gasket blew. And you also see how I have my cylinder head almost all the way at the top. And so now I've got a piece of 150 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to lightly sand away at the surface here to try to make sure I remove everything from the mating surface. There we go. Now I'm happy with how clean this is. That's got a nice, smooth mating surface. And then I can take my head gasket, and that's going to go like right about there. And then I've got my engine head. I'm going to take one of my bolts, and I'm going to go ahead and place the lower bolt in first, because that's going to be one of the harder ones to get. And one of the other bolts through. And then my head gasket around those bolts, like that. And we're just going to have to hand tighten these for a little bit before we actually get these down to where we want them for our final placement. I'll go ahead and put in my next bolt. Make sure that it goes in correctly. I might need to loosen up and adjust this. I'm not going at all to any form of final torque yet. I just need to get this through the gasket and properly seat it onto the head. There's that bolt. And our fourth bolt. You notice I'm working around trying to work in a bit of a crisscross pattern. And all I'm doing right now is just snugging up these bolts, because at the end of the day, what we're going to need is even clamping pressure on that gasket. Even pressure is the name of the game. And now for the cylinder head bolts, the final torque is going to be 17.5 foot-pounds, which exceeds the limits of my 1/4" torque wrench. So I want to use my 3/8" torque wrench. Then I'm going to start with one of the bolts after I've got them all snugged up here. And I'm just going to work these down a little bit further to continue to snug them up. All right, keep working the pattern to slowly increase the torque. There we go. Next bolt. There we go. Now all of our bolts are at final torque. I'm going to go ahead and put the push rods back in. Just like that. And now to assemble the valve cover, we're going to go ahead and put the little flat plates at each end of the spring, 1 and 2. And then we've got our rocker arms. There's a little dimpled end that's going to line up to go on the push rod. And then on the bolt, you'll notice there is a T20 screw in the middle of this. I'm going to go ahead and screw this on. We'll get back to that in a second for what that means. And then we will repeat on the lower, making sure we get the dimpled end over the push rod. And now this is probably a good place to point out that you notice how I had my cylinder head all the way at the top. So I had that at top dead center. You might have to be able to adjust your engine and cycle it through to get that piston head at top dead center. But then now I've got a feeler gauge here. I'm going to use the 0.005 or the 0.127 millimeter feeler gauge. And that's going to go right here behind the valve cover, or behind on top of the spring. I'm going to have to loosen up the hex screw here with my T20 screwdriver. Then I'm going to tighten this down. Back this out a little bit farther, so that my feeler gauge fits. Something like that. That feels pretty good. And then now I'm going to go ahead and tighten down my lock screw like that. So I've got my clearance right there. Now I'm going to repeat on the lower. Obviously I can tell I'm going to have to back out my T20 torque screw here a bit to get started. I'm going to go ahead and put in my feeler gauge, hand tighten this down to right about there. Now I'm going to set my set screw. I'm not sure there's an exact torque on this, but get this nice and firm. Like that, and we're good. Now off the old cylinder head, we're going to have to salvage a couple parts. Most notably is going to be this valve cover, and then there's also going to be a bracket on the side here for a carburetor, in which our plastic in which our O-ring will seat in. Just use a small screwdriver. That should come off like that. You'll notice there is another gasket right there. You can see where that's broken off, but so we're going to have to clean the back side of this to get the gasket off. We have replacement gaskets for this to mount on the side. So that's an easy one to remove. And then the other one that we're going to have to deal with is to get our valve cover and the bolts that hold it in. So a 10mm socket, we're going to remove the extension studs. And the other bolts. Remember, we do have a new gasket for this, so I'm not really worried about the gasket on this. All right, and now this should come off. Obviously, there's going to be oil coming out. We have a gasket on here that we're going to have to remove. Now I'm going to use my gasket scraper to help me to at least try to get this off. So now after you scrape your gasket thoroughly, there's going to be some shavings in there, and you've sanded things down, take a shop towel and just wipe out your valve cover gasket. Make sure you get all the little debris that's in it out. You don't want that getting back into your engine and causing damage. Wipe it out. So it should be nice and clean on the inside. And in this case here, neatness does count. You don't want any little stragglers of debris in there that could cause damage to your cylinder. There we go. That looks good to me. And then I've got our new valve cover gasket that came in the kit that just overlays like this. And now we're going to go back to the mower and put this on. So at the mower, I've got my assembly here with my valve cover. I'm going to go ahead and push through my first bolt. I'm going to make my first bolt be the ones that go on the carburetor side. Let's go ahead and hand start these. And now I've got two more bolts, one at the top and one at the bottom, just to quickly get into place. I'm not worried about torque yet. And then the one on top. I'm just going to work on snugging these up in a crisscross pattern. And then now I'm going to use a 1/4 inch torque wrench set to 110 inch-pounds to go ahead and bring these bolts to final torque. Apparently I've got a little further to go. There we go. That's all put on. And now over on the carburetor side, I'm going to go ahead and take the piece I put off the old engine. Then I've got my new gasket here all lubed up. And this is going to go right here, but there's going to be a little bit of assembly to get all of this together. And it's a little bit of a trick, because then we also have the other piece here to go on top, like this. And then another gasket on the carburetor. So there's a gasket sandwich here of parts to get all of this together. So a little bit tricky to show on camera because I basically have to make a gasket sandwich of sorts. Then I'm going to use my 8mm socket. Just go ahead and tighten that up. Now, as far as I'm aware, I could not find a specific torque number for this part of the engine. I'm sure there is one, and if you can find it, I would love to know what it is. And then I'm going to be mindful to make sure I get my return spring here correct and placed back in the mower through there and then down through the front. Like that. And make sure we get our linkages here right. And then this is going to go over to our exhaust thermostat. So now over on the exhaust side of the mower, we've got our thermostat, which looks like this, but this has the connecting wire that goes into it. So we're going to reset that in before we go too far. And then now we're going to have a gasket sandwich again. We're going to have a gasket on either side of this, like this. And then our muffler is going to attach. Let me see if I can bring you around to the other side. And then now it's a matter of a little bit of a game of trying to get all of these bolts and the gaskets correct. And once we got all of that through, and then we're going to use our 13mm socket to work our bolts into place. And then I'm just going to get it hand tight. One of the things I'm going to check when I'm aligning is to make sure the hole at the top of the muffler lines up with the hole here so I can get my muffler guard on correctly. And then once I feel like I've got these bolts tight, again, I can't find a torque spec for these bolts. If you know one, other than just good and tight, please share it in the comments. And now we can take our muffler guard, put that on over the front, set that down, put our top screw in. This is going to go in with our 8mm socket. And then we've got the two other bolts that have to go through the guard. These are a little bit tricky to get through. Once you've got the rest of the screws attaching your muffler guard back on, now might be a good time to go ahead and reinstall your spark plug. So then we can route the wiring. I'm going to start that by hand. That feels about good and tight. Go ahead and run your spark plug wire down. I'm going to go ahead and connect my electrode like that. Making sure my wire is running carefully around. I'm going to come back once again and double check my linkages here. I just rechecked it and it should look like this. It might have looked incorrect at the beginning after I was tinkering with trying to figure out what was wrong. This would be the correct orientation. That's why you should take a picture before you take apart your mower to make sure you have the correct layout of your springs and your connecting rods on top of your carburetor. And then the next thing is going to be to install our air cleaner, air intake assembly. Remember, we got the hose right here, and we're going to have to reattach to our air cleaner. There's also a paper gasket that goes on our mating surface. So this is going to be a bit of a trick of getting all of our parts together at the same time. And then I can reach down from the top and make sure I get that hose connected. Come back over and we got our two 8mm bolts to tighten up. These nice and firm. And then we have our guard to install that protects our carburetor springs. That goes like this. I always set the rear one first. This is an 8mm as well. And then it's going to be a 10mm on the front. Now that I've got my front guard on, yes, I am missing a bolt. I have to get another replacement bolt there. I'm going to put my engine cowling on. I'm going to route my hour meter cord back around after I get this on to get that under and around. This just drops on. There's the 3 bolts on top. Then I'm going to put my recoil starter, line that up with those 3 bolts. And make sure that the recoil starter is accessible. Just like that. Then we have 3 bolts to put on top. This uses an 8mm socket to secure. And now I have rerouted my hour meter cord. Then I'm going to check my engine oil to make sure I've got enough oil. It didn't get lost in the process of the repair. This is also a good time to do an oil change. And it looks like I am going to have to add some more oil. And then now, my final step is going to be to remove my rags and turn on the fuel. And now it's time to test the repair. And so indeed, success, our mower is now running again. If you like this kind of video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Click the subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Thanks for watching, and as always, have a great day. Bye.